I'm Elise Morrow, 31 years old, and I serve as a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy. Assigned to a classified intelligence directorate most people will never know exists. For 13 years, I let my own family believe I washed out of boot camp. I missed holidays, hospital visits, and my father's final days, all to protect a cover story the Navy built around me the day they pulled me from my rack at 0400. But when a SEAL Admiral grabbed my arm at my own father's memorial and told me to move because the front row was for military only, while my mother sat there and said nothing, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been dismissed by the people who were supposed to believe in you the most? If so, tell me your story in the comments. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand your ground after being underestimated by your own family, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about quiet dignity and reclaiming your worth. What happened next might surprise you. I grew up in Virginia Beach, 3 blocks from the ocean, in a house that smelled like salt air and boot polish. My father was Master Chief Petty Officer Oliver Morrow, United States Navy, SEAL teams, 30 years of service. He deployed more than he was home. I learned early that a military family doesn't run on schedules. It runs on faith. Faith that the door will open again. Faith that the boots in the hallway will come back muddy and worn and alive. My mother, Sandra, held everything together. School runs, bills, grocery shopping at the commissary on Tuesdays, oil changes on the minivan because my father was never around to do them. She hosted block parties where she smiled so wide you'd never know she hadn't slept in 3 days wondering whether her husband was still breathing. She sat through parent-teacher conferences alone. She learned how to fix the garbage disposal, how to patch drywall, how to file taxes with a deployed spouse's pay stubs. She was strong in a way nobody gave her credit for. And I think that's part of what hardened her over the years. When you carry everything alone for long enough, the muscles you build don't always relax when the weight lifts. My brother Tyler was 4 years older than me. Football captain, homecoming court, the kind of kid teachers talked about at faculty lunches. He was loud and social and easy to love. He went to Virginia Tech on a partial scholarship, got a degree in construction management, and moved to Richmond after graduation. Tyler was the golden child, not because he was more talented or smarter, but because he was visible. He had a career you could explain at a dinner party. He came home for holidays. He called on Sundays. He was the child my mother could point to and feel like she'd done something right. And then there was me. I was quieter. I sat in the back of classrooms and watched. I read books that were too old for me and asked questions that made adults uncomfortable. When my father came home from deployment, Tyler would tackle him in the driveway, and they'd throw a football until Sandra called them in for dinner. I'd wait. I'd sit on the porch steps and watch the car pull in, and when my father walked up the path, I'd just look at him. He'd kneel down, put his hands on my shoulders, and say, "What are you thinking about, Elise?" And I'd ask him something real, where he'd been, what the water looked like at night, whether he'd been scared. He never answered directly, but he'd get this look, this flicker behind his eyes, like the question itself meant more to him than the answer ever could. My father was not a man who showed emotion easily. 30 years in the SEAL teams will do that. But in those moments, kneeling on the front walkway, looking at his daughter who asked him things nobody else did, I could see it. Pride, not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the kind that lives in the space between what you say and what you mean. I wanted to be like him, not like the version Tyler idolized. The dad who grilled burgers and threw footballs and told war stories at barbecues with the other SEAL families. I wanted the version that disappeared for months and came back different. The version that carried things he couldn't talk about. The version that woke up at 0400 even when he didn't have to, because his body had been trained to treat rest as a luxury. I didn't fully understand what that life meant at 17. I just knew it was the truest thing about him, and I wanted it to be the truest thing about me. The summer after I graduated high school, I told him I was enlisting. We were in the garage, his sanctuary, the one place in the house that was entirely his. He had a truck engine half apart on the floor and grease on his forearms up to the elbows. I sat on an overturned bucket and said, "Dad, I'm joining the Navy." He didn't look up right away. He tightened a bolt, set the wrench down, and wiped his hands on a rag that was already black. Then he looked at me and said, "The Navy will take everything you're willing to give. Make sure you know what that means." I told him I did. He nodded. He didn't smile. He didn't try to talk me out of it. He just picked up the wrench and went back to the engine. That was his way of saying yes. My mother cried for 2 days. She wanted me to go to college to get a degree to have what she called a normal life. Tyler thought I was being dramatic. "You're not, Dad," he said at dinner. "You're not going to be a SEAL." I didn't argue with him. I signed the papers the week after graduation, and in August of 2013, I reported to Recruit Training Command, Great Lakes, Illinois. I was 18 years old, 132 pounds, and more certain about something than I'd ever been in my life. Boot camp was hard in all the ways they tell you, and a few they don't. The sleep deprivation was constant. The yelling was relentless. The physical grind wore down people who were bigger and stronger than me by the end of week 1. But I loved it. I thrived on the structure, the discipline, the clarity of knowing exactly what was expected and delivering it. I was top of my division in fitness, first in the run, first in the swim, second in push-ups behind a girl from Oklahoma who outweighed me by 40 pounds. I was top 3 in academics. My recruit division commander, a chief petty officer named Brennan, pulled me aside during week 2 and told me I had something he didn't see often. He didn't say what it was. He just said, "Keep your head down and keep performing." 3 weeks in, I was pulled from my rack at 0400 by 2 men in civilian clothes. No uniforms, no name tags. One of them had a manila folder with my name on it. They told me I'd been selected for a program, and I needed to come with them. They didn't explain what the program was. They didn't give me a choice. My drill instructor was told I'd been separated for medical reasons. My bunkmates were told I washed out. The official record showed an administrative discharge, failure to adapt. My family was told I quit. I called my mother from a payphone 2 days later. The phone was in a hallway with fluorescent lights that buzzed and flickered. The man who'd pulled me from my rack was standing 6 feet away, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. I dialed home. My mother answered on the second ring. I told her I was out. She was quiet for 3 seconds, I counted, and then she said, "Your father is going to be so disappointed." I wanted to tell her the truth. I wanted to explain that I hadn't quit, that I'd been chosen, that the 2 men with the manila folder had flagged my pre-enlistment aptitude scores, top 1% nationally, and pulled me into an accelerated intelligence pipeline run by the Office of Naval Intelligence. I wanted to tell her that this was bigger than boot camp, bigger than the SEAL teams, bigger than anything she could imagine. But the man against the wall shook his head. One slow shake, left to right. So I said, "I know, Mom. I'm sorry." And I hung up. That phone call cost me 13 years of my family. The lie that I washed out of boot camp didn't just stick. It calcified. It became the foundation of every conversation my family ever had about me. My mother brought it up at Thanksgiving. Elise couldn't even finish basic training. She mentioned it to the neighbors when they asked what I was doing with my life. She told her friends at church that her daughter tried the military thing, but it wasn't for her. Tyler picked it up and sharpened it into a weapon. My sister washed out of boot camp in 3 weeks, he'd say, shaking his head with a grin that was supposed to look sympathetic but never did. 3 weeks, couldn't hack it. And every year that passed, the story hardened further. It stopped being something that happened to me and became something that defined me. I was the Morrow kid who failed. Tyler was the one who succeeded. That was the story, and nobody had any reason to question it because I couldn't give them one. Meanwhile, I was becoming someone else entirely. The intelligence pipeline moved fast. After being pulled from boot camp, I spent 14 weeks at a training facility I'm not allowed to name, learning things I'm not allowed to describe. I earned my rate as an intelligence specialist within my first year. I was sharp with languages. I picked up Arabic in 6 months, Farsi in 8. By 2015, I'd advanced to Petty Officer Second Class and been selected for the Seaman to Admiral Commissioning Program, the Navy's fast track from enlisted to officer for high-performing sailors with the aptitude and the drive. I completed an accelerated degree program at a Navy-affiliated university, cramming 4 years into 2, while maintaining my intelligence qualifications. In 2017, I was commissioned as an ensign. I was 22 years old, a naval officer, and my family thought I was answering phones at some government desk. I served aboard a guided missile destroyer for 2 years after commissioning, the USS Halsey, home-ported in San Diego. I deployed to the Western Pacific and the Arabian Gulf. I ran the ship's intelligence division, briefing the commanding officer daily on threats, movements, and classified communications that shaped our patrol routes. I was promoted to lieutenant junior grade after 18 months. Then, in 2019, I received orders that changed the trajectory of my career. Assignment to the Joint Special Operations Command Intelligence Fusion Cell at Fort Liberty, North Carolina. JSOC was where everything I'd been trained for came together. I provided targeting support for Tier 1 Special Operations Forces, the same SEAL teams my father had spent his career in. I analyzed intelligence that led to direct action missions. I sat in operations centers, watching live feeds of raids and rescues, and things I will never speak about. I was promoted to lieutenant in 2020. I deployed to theaters I will never name, supported missions I will never discuss, and watched things happen on screens at 0300 that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. And every Thanksgiving, when I managed to come home, my mother would introduce me to whoever was at the table as my daughter who tried the Navy, but it wasn't for her. I never corrected her. I couldn't. The cover story was the cover story, and it didn't matter that it made me the family punchline. It didn't matter that it let my brother call me a failure to my face. The intelligence I handled was compartmented at the highest levels of the Department of Defense. If I broke cover, even to my own family, people could die. Operations could be compromised. So I sat at that table year after year, and I took it. But there was one conversation that kept me going during the worst of it. Thanksgiving of 2019. I'd come home for 2 days, the most I could manage between deployments. The house was full. Tyler was there with his wife and his daughter. Aunts and uncles filled the dining room. My mother was holding court in the kitchen, telling everyone about Tyler's latest construction project, a strip mall in Henrico County. When I walked in, she glanced at me and said, "Oh, Elise made it. Good." After dinner, I slipped out to the garage. I needed air. I needed silence. I stood there in the dark, leaning against my father's workbench, the same bench where I'd told him I was enlisting 6 years earlier. The engine parts were gone. He'd replaced them with tool organizers and a radio that only played country stations. I could hear the family laughing inside. The garage door opened. My father stepped in. He didn't turn on the light. He just leaned against the opposite wall and crossed his arms. We stood like that for maybe a minute. Then he said quietly, "I've been in the teams long enough to know what separated for medical reasons looks like. And that ain't you." My eyes filled. I couldn't speak. I couldn't confirm or deny. I just stood there in the dark, trying to keep my breathing steady. He nodded once, slowly. That's all I needed. He pushed off the wall, walked toward the door, and then stopped. Without turning around, he said, "I'm proud of you, kid, whatever it is." And he went back inside. He never brought it up again. He never corrected my mother at the dinner table. He never pulled Tyler aside and told him to stop making jokes. He respected the clearance more than he wanted to defend his daughter, because he understood, better than anyone in that family, that some things are more important than being understood. That was the last real conversation we ever had about my career. He carried my secret to his grave. Tyler's resentment grew sharper through 2020 and 2021. His marriage fell apart, his wife left him for a coworker, took the house, and moved to Northern Virginia with their daughter. Tyler was left with child support payments, a half-empty apartment in Richmond, and a contracting business that was bleeding money. He started drinking more. He started showing up to family dinners with an edge. And he started directing that edge at me. In his mind, I was everything wrong with the world. I had a government job I couldn't explain. I drove a modest car. I lived in a small apartment. I showed up to holidays with nothing to show for myself. No husband, no kids, no career trajectory anyone could track. He called me the family freeloader behind my back. He said it to my mother, to our cousins, to anyone who would listen. And my mother didn't correct him. She never corrected him, because in her mind he was right. I remember one particular dinner, Thanksgiving of 2021. I'd come home after 72 straight hours inside a JSOC operations center. We'd been coordinating a hostage rescue in West Africa. 3 Americans had been taken by a militant group, and my targeting cell had been running around the clock to locate them. We found them, the operators went in. All 3 hostages came home alive. I drove straight from Fort Liberty to Virginia Beach, changed clothes in my car, and walked into my mother's house carrying a store-bought pie because I hadn't had time to bake one. Tyler was already at the table. He looked at me, looked at the pie, and said, "Must be nice collecting a government check for doing nothing." My mother laughed. Not a mean laugh, the kind of laugh that comes from years of agreeing with something so completely that it doesn't even register as cruel anymore. I sat down. I ate the turkey. I smiled when I was supposed to smile. And I drove home at 9 that night, alone, in the dark, on I-64, replaying the sound of my mother's laugh. I sat in my car in the driveway after I parked. Every light was on inside the house, my apartment, not my mother's. But the habit was the same. I sat in the dark and looked at a lit window and felt like I was on the outside of my own life. I'd spent the last week helping save 3 people's lives, and the highlight of my Thanksgiving was being called a freeloader by my brother while my mother nodded along. That was the night I started to wonder if the cover story was costing me more than it was worth. In 2021, I was selected for a classified Naval Intelligence Directorate that reported directly to the Director of National Intelligence. This was the deep end. I was promoted to Lieutenant Commander, 04, and assigned to run a targeting cell that supported Tier 1 special operations. The work was the most consequential of my career. The people I worked with were the best in the intelligence community, and the security protocols around my assignment were so tight that even my commanding officer at JSOC hadn't known I was being reassigned until the orders came through with a classification marking he'd never seen before. I was 26 years old. I held one of the highest clearances in the Department of Defense. And my family still thought I answered phones. In 2023, my father started slowing down. He was 57 and still active duty, 30 years in the teams, approaching mandatory retirement. He'd been talking about it for months, planning a fishing trip to the Outer Banks with his SEAL buddies, maybe buying a boat. But the energy wasn't there. Sandra noticed first he was sleeping more, eating less, losing weight he couldn't afford to lose. The Navy doctors ran tests in October. The results came back in November. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. By the time they found it, there was nothing meaningful to find. The oncologist at Naval Medical Center Portsmouth told my father he had 6 to 12 months. My father sat in the exam room, looked at the doctor, and said, "That's more time than some of the guys I served with got." Sandra broke down. Tyler drove down from Richmond and didn't leave for a week. I requested emergency leave the day I heard. It was denied. I was in the middle of an operational cycle that couldn't be interrupted. Active targeting operations with lives on the line. My directorate commander told me she was sorry, that she understood, but that the mission couldn't pause. I missed the diagnosis appointment. I missed the first round of treatment. I missed the second round. I missed 3 family visits in a row. Sandra stopped calling to update me. Tyler texted once. "Nice of you to show up for nothing as usual." I stared at that text on my phone for 10 minutes before I set it face down on my desk and went back to work. The worst part was that he wasn't entirely wrong. I wasn't showing up. Not because I didn't want to. I would have given anything to be in that hospital room, but the work I was doing was protecting people who would never know my name, and the cost of walking away, even for a week, was measured in lives. My father would have understood that. He'd lived that same math for 30 years, but Tyler didn't know that, and Sandra didn't know that, and I couldn't tell them. So I absorbed the resentment the way I'd absorbed everything else, silently, completely, alone. My father died on January 14th, 2025, at Naval Medical Center Portsmouth. He was 58 years old. He'd served 30 years and 4 months in the United States Navy. He held a Bronze Star with Valor, 2 Purple Hearts, and the respect of every operator who'd ever stood beside him. I arrived 6 hours after his death. I'd been on a plane from a classified location. I can't say where. I can't say why. The moment I landed at Norfolk International and turned on my phone, I saw 17 missed calls. I didn't need to listen to the voicemails. I knew. I drove straight to the hospital. The hallways smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee. I found my mother standing outside his room. She looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger exactly, but something past anger. Something tired and final. She didn't speak. She turned and walked into the room where my father's body was still lying, and she closed the door behind her. I stood in that hallway for 11 minutes. I counted the ceiling tiles. There were 47. A nurse walked past me twice. A chaplain offered to sit with me. I said no thank you. When the door finally opened, it was Tyler. He looked at me and said, "You're too late." Then he walked past me toward the elevator. I went into the room. My father looked peaceful, smaller than I remembered, thinner, but peaceful. His hands were folded on his chest. Someone had placed his trident pin on the bedside table. I sat in the chair next to his bed and stayed for 2 hours. I didn't cry. I held his hand and I told him things I should have told him years ago. I told him I was still in. I told him about JSOC, about the fusion cell, about the directorate. I told him about operations I'd supported and people I'd helped bring home. I told him everything I'd never been allowed to say. And I told him I was sorry, not for the work, but for every holiday I missed, every phone call I couldn't return, every moment I chose the mission over the family. He couldn't hear me, but I think somewhere he already knew. The memorial was scheduled for July, 6 months after his death. Naval Station Norfolk Chapel, full military honors. My father had earned every bit of it. 30 years in the SEAL teams, multiple combat deployments, medals that would take a full page to list, and the kind of reputation that made younger operators stand a little straighter when his name came up. The chapel would be packed. SEALs in dress whites, officers from across the special operations community. Family and friends in the pews behind them. I drove to the base alone on a Saturday morning. The sky was overcast, that heavy gray Virginia sky that sits on everything like a blanket. I wore a black dress, simple. No jewelry except my father's watch, which I'd taken from the hospital. No uniform, no insignia, no rank. I made that choice deliberately. This was my father's day. I wasn't there as Lieutenant Commander Morrow. I was there as Oliver's daughter. Just his daughter. The chapel was already full when I arrived. I could see Sandra and Tyler in the front row with aunts, uncles, and cousins I hadn't seen in years. Uncle Ray and Aunt Patricia. Tyler's ex-wife hadn't come, but his daughter Lily was there, sitting on Sandra's lap. The pews behind them were a sea of white uniforms and gold stripes. I recognized faces, SEALs I'd provided intelligence for, officers I'd briefed, men who'd carried out missions based on targeting packages my cell had built. None of them recognized me. I was just a woman in a black dress. At the podium, adjusting his notes, was Rear Admiral James McEvans. 2 stars, United States Navy. He'd been my father's commanding officer for the last decade of Oliver's career. The man who'd pinned on my father's last promotion, who'd signed off on his final deployment, who'd visited him in the hospital 3 times during treatment. McEvans was old-school Navy, tall, square-jawed, silver-haired, the kind of officer who filled a room just by standing in it. He was running the ceremony. I walked down the center aisle toward the front. My heels clicked on the chapel floor. Sandra saw me first. She stiffened, her jaw tightened. She leaned toward McEvans, who had stepped down from the podium to greet arriving guests. I watched her lips move. I couldn't hear the words. I was still 20 feet away, but I found out later what she told him. She said, "That's my daughter. She's not military. She tried once, didn't make it through basic." McEvans nodded. A short, curt nod, the kind a flag officer gives when he's processing information and making a decision simultaneously. He stepped away from Sandra and intercepted me halfway down the aisle. He was tall, 6'2", maybe 6'3", and he moved with the kind of authority that doesn't ask permission. It just takes up space. He put his hand on my upper arm, not gently, firmly, the way you'd steer a stranger away from a restricted area. His grip was strong enough that I could feel each individual finger through the fabric of my dress. He looked down at me. I'm 5'6", so he had a good 8 inches on me, and he said, loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear, "Move! This row is for service members." The chapel didn't go silent all at once. It went silent in layers. The first row heard it and stopped talking. The second row noticed the first row had stopped and turned to look. By the time the silence reached the back of the chapel, every eye was on us. The rear admiral gripping the arm of a woman in a black dress, steering her away from the front pew at her own father's memorial. My brother Tyler looked down at his shoes. My mother sat straight-backed in the pew, her hands folded in her lap, and said nothing. Not one word. Not, "Wait," or, "That's my daughter," or, "There's been a misunderstanding." Nothing. She'd been the one who told McEvans I wasn't military. She'd been the one who set this in motion, and now she sat there and watched it happen. I didn't resist. I didn't argue. I didn't say, "I'm a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy, and I outrank half the people in this room." I just turned and started walking toward the back of the chapel. My heels clicked on the floor. 200 people watched me walk. SEALs, officers, enlisted, family, all of them watching a woman in a black dress get removed from the front row of her own father's memorial service. I kept my eyes forward. I kept my breathing steady. I did what I'd been doing for 13 years. I took it. Then McEvans's phone buzzed. He pulled it from the inside pocket of his dress whites and glanced at the screen. I was 5 steps away by then, still walking toward the back. he answered. I didn't hear the words, but I saw his face. I'd turned just slightly, the way you do when you're leaving a room and you can't help but look back one more time. And I saw it happen. The color drained from his cheeks. Not slowly, all at once, like someone had pulled a plug. His posture shifted. His shoulders, which had been squared and authoritative 3 seconds earlier, pulled back and then tightened in a way that had nothing to do with confidence. His free hand, the one that had just been gripping my arm, dropped to his side and stayed there. He said 2 words. Yes, sir. Then after a pause, understood, sir. He ended the call. The caller was Captain William Driscoll, the base commander at Naval Station Norfolk. Driscoll had been watching the chapel's live security feed from his office, standard protocol for high-profile ceremonies on base. He'd seen McCavins grab my arm. He'd seen Sandra point at me. And he knew exactly who I was because my directorate had briefed his command 6 months earlier as part of a routine security coordination. Driscoll didn't need to explain much. He told McKeevens who he had just put his hands on, and he told him to fix it. McKeevens turned around. I was halfway down the aisle by then, still walking, still silent, still keeping my eyes forward. The chapel was dead quiet. 200 people holding their breath. Lieutenant Commander Morrow. I stopped walking. My hand was on the back of a pew. The 8th row, I think. I didn't turn around immediately. I stood there for 2 full seconds, my fingers on the smooth wood of the pew, and I let the silence hold. Then I turned. Every head in that chapel was facing me. 200 people, my father's brothers in arms, his officers, his teammates, his family, all staring at the woman in the black dress who'd just been told she didn't belong. McKeevens walked toward me. His shoes echoed on the chapel floor. Sharp, deliberate steps, but slower than before. When he reached me, he came to attention. Full attention. Shoulders back, chin up, arms at his sides, eyes locked on mine. And he saluted. His voice cracked when he spoke. Ma'am, I didn't know. Please, the front row is yours. I returned the salute. I held it for a full beat, the way you're supposed to, the way they teach you, the way my father would have done it. Then I dropped my hand. I didn't speak. There was nothing to say that wouldn't have diminished the moment. I turned and walked back toward the front row. And as I walked, one by one, every uniformed officer in that chapel stood. It started in the 2nd row, a commander I didn't recognize, a man with silver oak leaves on his shoulders, who pushed back from the pew and rose to his feet. Then the row behind him. Then the next. Then the next. By the time I reached the front pew, every service member in the room was on their feet. The standing spread from the center outward, like a wave that started in the middle of the ocean and reached every shore at once. My mother's mouth was open. Her hands were no longer folded, they were gripping the edge of the pew in front of her. Tyler was staring at me. Not at the floor, not at his shoes, at me. Like he was seeing me for the first time in his life. Like the woman walking down that aisle was a stranger wearing his sister's face. I sat down. Sandra was 2 seats away. Neither of us spoke. The chapel was standing, and for the first time in 13 years, I didn't have to explain a thing. The ceremony continued. McKeevens returned to the podium and delivered his remarks about my father. He spoke about Oliver's 30 years of service, his leadership in the teams, the men he'd trained, and the missions he'd led. His voice was professional, steady, but I could see his hands trembling against the wood of the podium. He didn't mention me again during the eulogy. He didn't need to. Everyone in that room had already done the math. After the ceremony, people approached me. Not in a rush, quietly, one at a time, the way military people do when they want to show respect without making a scene. Handshakes, nods, a murmured ma'am here, a sorry for your loss, Commander there. A senior chief petty officer, a broad, weathered man with a SEAL trident on his chest and more deployment patches than I could count, stopped in front of me and said, "Your father talked about you. Not details, just pride." I nodded and thanked him and held it together until he walked away. Sandra watched from across the room. She was standing by the chapel entrance with Tyler and Aunt Patricia, and she hadn't moved in 20 minutes. She looked like someone who'd just been told that the sky was a different color than she'd spent her entire life believing it was. Tyler started to walk toward me twice. Both times, he stopped after 3 steps, turned around, and went back to Sandra. I left without going to the reception. Sandra was hosting it at her house, catered food, folding chairs in the backyard, a slideshow of my father's career playing on a laptop in the living room. I couldn't go. Not because I was angry. I wasn't. Not exactly. I was something deeper than angry. Something that didn't have a name yet. I drove back to my apartment in Norfolk, parked in the underground garage, took the elevator to the 3rd floor, unlocked my door, and sat down on the living room floor. I didn't move for 2 hours. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't eat. I didn't cry. I just sat there in the dark, leaning against the couch, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of 13 years pressing down on my chest like a physical thing. I thought about McKeevan's hand on my arm. I thought about my mother's silence. I thought about Tyler's shoes. I thought about the phone call, the salute, the chapel standing. And I thought about my father, the man who knew the truth and never said a word because he loved the work more than he loved being right. I wasn't angry. I wasn't relieved. I was empty in a way I hadn't felt since the night he died. Like something had been holding me up for 13 years and it had finally let go. 3 days later, I called Captain Grace Tanaka. Grace was the senior intelligence officer who had recruited me out of boot camp 13 years ago. The woman who'd stood at the end of that hallway while I called my mother from a payphone and shook her head when I wanted to tell the truth. She'd shepherded my career ever since. She was the one who recommended me for JSOC. She was the one who pushed my name forward for the Intelligence Directorate. She was, in every way that mattered, the person who'd built me into what I'd become. And she was the closest thing I had to a mother who understood what I did. I told her what happened at the memorial. Every detail, McKeevan's, the phone call, the salute, Sandra's face, Tyler's stare. Grace listened without interrupting. She let me talk until I ran out of words. Then she was quiet for a long time, 10 seconds, maybe 15, and she said, "You did nothing wrong, Elise. The cover story protected operations. It protected lives. Not just American lives, lives in countries your family will never visit, belonging to people they'll never meet. Your father understood that. He lived it." I asked her if my father had ever called her. I don't know why I asked. Maybe I needed to hear it from someone outside the family. Grace paused. Then she said, "Once, about 4 years ago, he called the general number for my office, which means he had to track it down because I'd never given it to him. He said, 'Captain Tanaka, I don't know what my daughter does, but I know it matters. I just wanted someone in her chain to know that her father is proud of her.' That's all he said. He hung up before I could respond. I sat with that for a long time after the call ended. I sat on the edge of my bed with the phone in my lap, and I let it wash over me. My father had called Grace. He'd tracked down her office number, not an easy thing to do for someone in her position, and he'd called her to say he was proud of me. He didn't ask what I did. He didn't try to extract information. He just wanted someone in my world to know that he saw me, that he knew, even without details, that his daughter was doing something that mattered. I'd spent years wondering if he was ashamed of me. Wondering if, when Sandra made her comments at the dinner table, he agreed with her silently. Wondering if his silence was disappointment. It wasn't. He was proud. He was always proud. He just couldn't say it to the people who needed to hear it. Not because he didn't want to, but because he understood, at a level most people never will, that some truths are too important to share, and that the cost of protecting those truths sometimes falls on the people you love the most. Meanwhile, at Sandra's house, the fallout was building. Tyler was pacing the living room. He'd been rattled since the chapel. Really rattled. The kind of unsettled that shows up in your hands and your voice, and the way you can't sit still. He kept replaying the moment, McKeevan's grabbing my arm. The phone call, the 2 words, "Yes, sir," the salute. Every officer standing, 200 military professionals rising to their feet for the woman his mother had just called a boot camp washout. Sandra was at the kitchen table. She hadn't moved from that chair since they got home from the reception. The catered food was untouched on the counter behind her. The slideshow of Oliver's career was still playing on the laptop in the living room, images of him in uniform, on deployment, at ceremonies, with his team. She could hear the soft click of photos changing from where she sat, but she wasn't looking. Tyler stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall. "How?" he said. "How does someone go from washing out of boot camp to being saluted by a 2-star admiral? How does that work?" Sandra didn't look up. Her hands were flat on the table, palms down, fingers spread. She was staring at the wood grain like it held an answer. "I don't know," she said. Tyler pushed. Has she been lying to us this whole time? 13 years of lies? Sandra finally looked at him. Her eyes were red, but dry. She'd moved past crying into something harder, something that sat deeper. She said quietly, "Or we've been wrong this whole time." Neither of them called me. I didn't expect them to. Not yet. The memorial had blown a hole in 13 years of family mythology, and they were still standing at the edge of the crater, trying to figure out what they were looking at. I understood that. I'd had 13 years to live with the truth. They'd had 90 minutes. Sandra called me 3 times over the next 2 days. I saw every call come in. I let them go to voicemail. I wasn't punishing her. I just didn't have the energy to explain 13 years of classified service over the phone between the hours of 7 and 10 p.m. while she was sitting in the same kitchen where she'd spent a decade calling me a failure. I sent one text. "I need some time. I'm okay." She stared at that text for an hour. Tyler told me later. Tyler did something I didn't expect. 5 days after the memorial, he drove to Naval Station Norfolk. He parked in the visitor lot, walked to the base public affairs office, and told the petty officer behind the desk that he was Elise Morrow's brother and he wanted to know what his sister did for the Navy. The petty officer, a young woman, maybe 23, looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up a phone and made a call. Tyler waited. He told me later that he stood at that counter for about 10 minutes feeling increasingly foolish while the petty officer spoke in low tones to someone he couldn't see. Then a door opened behind the counter and 2 men in civilian clothes stepped out. They were polite, professional. They showed credentials that identified them as Naval Criminal Investigative Service. They told Tyler in very clear and very calm language that they could not provide any information about personnel assigned to classified programs and that his visit had been noted. Then they escorted him off the base. Tyler called Sandra from the parking lot. His voice was shaking. "They escorted me off the base, Mom. NCIS. 2 agents for asking about my own sister." Sandra was quiet. Tyler said, "What is she into, Mom? What is she actually doing?" Sandra said, "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's bigger than we thought." Tyler didn't realize it at the time, but that visit confirmed more than any conversation ever could have. Federal agents don't escort you off a military installation for asking about a clerical worker. They do it when the person you're asking about operates at a level where even acknowledging their assignment is a security risk. I met with Grace Tanaka the following week. We sat in her office, a windowless room on the 3rd floor of a building that doesn't appear on any base map. I told her I was done hiding, not done with the cover. I wasn't going to compromise operations or endanger anyone. But I was done letting my family's version of me be the only version. I was done sitting at Thanksgiving tables and absorbing comments about washing out. I was done being the family punchline. Grace understood. She'd seen it before, intelligence officers whose cover stories ate their personal lives from the inside out. She told me the Navy wouldn't declassify my assignment. The specifics of my work, the directorate, the targeting cell, the operations I'd supported, would stay sealed. But there were things I could share. My rank, my commission, my years of continuous service, the fact that I was a naval officer, that I'd been in the Navy since I was 18, that I never left. The details would remain classified. But the truth, the big foundational truth that my family had gotten wrong for 13 years, was mine to tell. I decided I would tell them, but on my terms, on my timeline. Not because the memorial had forced my hand and not because Sandra or Tyler had demanded answers. Because I had earned the right to be seen, at least partially, at least enough. That night I opened my closet. My dress whites were hanging in the back, pressed, clean, still in the dry cleaning bag from the last time I'd worn them to a classified briefing 7 months ago. 2.5 gold stripes on the sleeves, the insignia of a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy. I'd never worn this uniform in front of my family, not once in 13 years. I ran my fingers along the sleeve and felt the weight of everything those stripes represented. The training, the deployments, the missions, the sacrifices, the phone call I couldn't make, the holidays I missed, the dinners I sat through in silence. I left the uniform in the bag. But I didn't close the closet door. 3 weeks after the memorial, I could feel the shift happening even from a distance. Sandra was unraveling, not dramatically, not publicly, but in the quiet way that people unravel when the story they've been telling themselves for over a decade turns out to be wrong. She started replaying years of comments, every Thanksgiving where she'd said, "I couldn't hack it." Every conversation with a neighbor where she'd waved her hand and said, "Elise tried the military thing, it wasn't for her." Every time she'd beamed at Tyler's latest construction project and then glanced at me with something between pity and disappointment. She pulled out old holiday photos, boxes of them, stored in the closet of the guest bedroom. She spread them across the dining table and looked at them one by one. Thanksgiving, 2014. Christmas, 2016. 4th of July, 2018. And she noticed what she'd missed. My composure. The careful way I answered questions about work, specific enough to sound normal, vague enough to reveal nothing. The way I deflected instead of denied. The practiced calm of someone who'd been trained to keep secrets in rooms full of people who wanted to break them. It had been there the whole time, in every photo, at every dinner, in every conversation. She just never thought to look. She called her friend Deborah, a Navy wife of 40 years, whose husband had retired as a captain. Deborah had seen things in her decades as a military spouse. She understood the world Sandra was only now discovering existed. Sandra told her everything: the memorial, McKeevan's, the phone call, the salute, every officer standing. Deborah listened. Then she said, "Sandra, people in those programs can't tell you. That's the whole point. The cover story isn't a lie. It's a shield." Sandra said, "But 13 years. Deborah cut her off. "She didn't lie to you. She protected you. There's a difference. And the fact that you can't see it yet doesn't mean it isn't true." Sandra hung up and sat at the kitchen table with her hands in her lap. She was starting to understand something that would take months to fully absorb. Her daughter hadn't abandoned the Navy. She'd gone deeper into it than Sandra had ever imagined possible. And the silence, the years of silence, the holidays of silence, the dinners of silence, wasn't indifference. It was discipline. Tyler was changing too. The NCIS encounter had scraped something raw in him. He'd spent years mocking me with the confidence of someone who was certain he was right, and now that certainty was gone. He sat in his truck one evening outside his apartment in Richmond, engine off, windows up, and thought about every time he'd called me a freeloader, every holiday joke, every eye roll when I said I couldn't talk about work. He picked up his phone and typed 2 words. "I'm sorry." He stared at them for 5 minutes before hitting send. I was at my desk when the text came in. I read it, sat back in my chair, and typed 2 words back. "I know." Tyler stared at that response for a long time. 2 words. No exclamation point, no emoji, no "it's okay" or "don't worry about it." Just, "I know." I think he expected absolution. What he got was acknowledgement. And I think, eventually, he understood that acknowledgement was more honest than absolution would have been. Word traveled through the Navy community in Virginia Beach. Military towns are small worlds, and the SEAL community is smaller still. Oliver Morrow's teammates, the men who'd deployed with him, trained with him, carried him on their shoulders at his retirement ceremony, started reaching out to Sandra. Not to scold her, not to shame her, just to offer context. A retired senior chief named Pete Garza showed up at her door one afternoon. Pete was 61, barrel-chested, with a handshake that could bend steel. He'd served with my father for 15 years, 3 deployments together, 2 of which had gone badly enough to bond them for life. Sandra invited him in. She made coffee. Pete sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Sandra had been sitting for weeks trying to make sense of her own daughter, and he told her something she'd never heard before. He said, "Oliver called me about 4 years ago. Middle of the night. He'd been drinking, not drunk, just enough to loosen him up. He said, 'Pete, my daughter's doing things I'll never know about, and I've never been more proud.' I asked what he meant. He said, 'I can't tell you. I just needed to say it to someone who'd understand.' That was it." He hung up. Sandra broke down. She cried in a way I don't think she'd cried since the day my father died. Deep, convulsive sobs that came from somewhere below the chest, below the stomach, from the place where you keep the things you're most ashamed of. Because she'd just heard, from a man who'd known her husband for 15 years, that Oliver had always known the truth. He'd known I didn't wash out, he'd known I was doing something extraordinary, and he'd never said a word to her, not because he didn't trust her, but because he trusted the work even more. Sandra sat alone that night, holding Oliver's trident pin. She turned it over in her hands, the metal eagle, the trident, the anchor, the pistol, the pin that represented everything her husband had been. And she finally understood that her husband and her daughter had shared a world she'd never been invited into. Not because they didn't love her, but because that was what the job demanded. Sandra sent me a text on a Saturday morning in late August. "The Lighthouse Diner. Saturday. Just us. Please." The Lighthouse was a little place on Shore Drive where my father used to take us after church when Tyler and I were kids. Sticky vinyl booths, laminated menus, a waitress named June who called everyone Han and poured coffee before you asked for it. I hadn't been there in years. I stared at the text for a full day before responding. I didn't know what I was walking into, an interrogation, an apology, a fight, a lecture. I typed OK on Sunday morning and hit send before I could talk myself out of it. I drove there on Saturday. I parked in the gravel lot behind the building and sat in my car for 3 minutes watching the front door. I rehearsed a dozen versions of the conversation in my head. In some of them, I was calm and measured. In others, I said things I'd been holding for 13 years. Sharp things, true things, things that would have felt good to say and terrible to hear. In the end, I didn't need any of them. Sandra was already in the booth when I walked in. Her hands were wrapped around a coffee mug, the white ceramic kind with the diner's logo faded off the side. Her eyes were red, not freshly red, the sustained red of someone who'd been crying on and off for weeks. She looked smaller than I remembered. Older, thinner, the kind of tired that doesn't come from a bad night's sleep. It comes from carrying the wrong story for a very long time and finally setting it down. She spoke first. She didn't ask what I did. She didn't ask about McKeevan's or the salute or the phone call or the officer's standing or any of the questions I'd prepared myself to deflect. She said, "I told people you failed for 13 years, and you let me." I looked at her. My mother, the woman who'd held our family together through 30 years of deployments, the woman who'd learned to fix garbage disposals and patch drywall and file taxes alone, the woman who'd turned that strength into something sharp enough to cut her own daughter. I said, "I had to." She closed her eyes. She kept them closed for a long time. Then she said, "Your father tried to tell me once. Not in words, he'd get this look when I'd make one of my comments about you. Like I was getting it wrong. Like he wanted to say something but couldn't. I ignored it every time. Every single time." I reached across the table and put my hand on hers. Her fingers were cold from the coffee mug. We sat like that for a long time. June came by with the pot. She looked at us, read the room the way only a waitress with 30 years of experience can, and walked away without pouring. Sandra asked, "Can you tell me anything?" I told her what I could. I told her I was a commissioned officer, a lieutenant commander. I told her I'd been in the Navy continuously since I was 18, that I never left, never quit, never washed out. I told her my work was classified and I couldn't say more than that. I told her that the things I'd missed, the holidays, the hospital visits, the phone calls I didn't return, weren't choices I made lightly. Every absence had a reason. I just wasn't allowed to give it. She nodded, slowly, processing. Then she asked the only question that mattered. "Are you safe?" I paused. I thought about the operations centers, the targeting cells, the screens at 0300, the missions that went right and the ones that didn't. The deployments to places where safe was a relative term. I said, "Most of the time." Sandra laughed. A short, surprised laugh. The kind that escapes before you can catch it. The kind you make when something is funny and painful at the same time. It sounded like my father's humor. We both heard it. Neither of us said so. She didn't need the whole truth. She just needed enough to stop filling the gaps with the wrong story. And for the first time in 13 years, I was allowed to give her that much. We walked out of the diner together. The sun was bright in the parking lot, that sharp Virginia Beach sun that bounces off everything and makes you squint. Sandra stopped at my car and did something she hadn't done since I was a teenager. She put her arm through mine. Not a hug, something more casual than that, more natural, like it was something she'd been doing all along. She held on for a moment, then let go and walked to her own car. I sat in the driver's seat and watched her pull away. The parking lot smelled like gravel and salt water and coffee. And I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, Something I didn't have a word for yet. Not relief, not forgiveness, not closure. Something quieter, something that felt like the beginning of something. 6 months after the diner, things were different. Not fixed, not healed. Different. Sandra and I talked on the phone every week. Short calls at first, weather, what she was cooking, whether the neighbor's dog had finally stopped barking at 3 a.m. Then longer ones. She asked about my apartment, whether I'd repainted the kitchen, like I'd mentioned months ago, whether I was eating enough. She never asked about the work. I appreciated that more than she'd ever know. Tyler apologized in person. He drove down from Richmond on a Saturday in October and stood in Sandra's kitchen while she was in the other room. He looked at me and said, "I've been a terrible brother. I know that. I don't know how to fix it, but I want to try." I told him trying was enough. He hugged me, the first time he'd hugged me in 5 years, maybe longer. It was awkward and too tight, and he held on a second longer than he meant to. It was perfect. Thanksgiving of 2025 was the first one in 3 years where I sat at that table and nobody made a comment about my career. When a cousin asked what I did, Tyler answered before I could. "She can't talk about it," he said, and he left it at that. No joke, no eye roll, no follow-up, just a simple statement of fact, delivered with a kind of quiet respect I'd never heard from him before. Sandra introduced me to a neighbor who stopped by with a pie. She said, "This is my daughter, Elise. She's in the Navy." No caveats, no qualifiers, no, she tried once, but just, she's in the Navy. 3 words that had taken 13 years to arrive. In January, I received orders for a new assignment, a joint intelligence billet at a combatant command overseas. It was a career-defining posting. I'd be gone for at least 2 years, running operations in a theater I can't name, doing work that would push me harder than anything I'd done before. I was ready. I'd been ready my whole career. I told Sandra over the phone. She was quiet for a long time, 10 seconds, maybe 15. I could hear her breathing. Then she said softly, "Come home when you can. I'll leave the light on." My chest tightened. I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles went white. That was what Oliver used to say. Before every deployment, standing in the driveway with his sea bag over his shoulder, he'd look at Sandra and say those exact words. "I'll be home when I can. Leave the light on." She'd never said it to me, not once in 13 years, only to him. And now she was giving it to me, his words, her voice, the same promise. I said, "I will, Mom." And I meant it. The night before I flew out, I finally opened the handwritten note from my father's belongings. It had been sitting in a box since January, the box the Navy returned after he died. His trident pin, a folded flag, a few personal items, and a single piece of lined paper folded twice. Written in his blocky, deliberate handwriting. I'd carried that box through 2 moves and 7 months of grief. I'd opened it 3 times, once to take the trident pin, once to look at the flag, once to make sure the note was still there. But I'd never unfolded it. I wasn't ready. That night, I was ready. I sat on the edge of my bed in my empty apartment, sea bag packed, uniform pressed, alarm set for 0400. I unfolded the note. The paper was lined, torn from a yellow legal pad. The handwriting was shaky. He'd written it near the end, when the medication made his hands tremble. It was dated December 27th, 2024, 3 weeks before he died. It read, "Elise, I never told your mother the truth. That's on me, not you. I should have fought harder for you at that table. I should have said something every time she made her comments. I didn't, and I'm sorry. You are the best of me. Not Tyler, not the teams, not 30 years of service. You. I love you, kid. Dad." I read it once, then I read it again, then I held it against my chest and closed my eyes. I stayed like that until my alarm went off. I don't know if I slept. I don't think I did. I folded the note and put it in the breast pocket of my uniform. I zipped my sea bag. I turned off the light. The apartment was empty. I closed the door and walked to my car and drove to the airfield in the dark. It's been a year now. I'm overseas, deep in my assignment, doing the work I was built for. The operations tempo is relentless. 16-hour days, briefings before sunrise, decisions that carry weight I can't describe, and consequences I can't discuss. But I'm good at this. I've always been good at this. The people I work with know who I am. They know my rank, my record, my clearance level. They call me by my name, and they mean it. There's no cover story here, no fiction, no carefully constructed lie that makes me someone smaller than I am. For 12 hours a day, I am exactly who I'm supposed to be. On Sundays, I video call Sandra. She asks about the weather, the food, whether I'm sleeping enough. She never asks about the work. She tells me about the garden. She planted tomatoes this year, the first time since my father died. She tells me about Tyler's daughter's softball season, about the new family that moved in next door. Small things, normal things. The kind of things she used to save for Tyler because she didn't think I cared. I care. I always cared. Sandra has started volunteering at the Fleet and Family Support Center in Norfolk. She helps Navy spouses navigate deployments, paperwork, the particular loneliness of loving someone who disappears for months at a time without explanation. She told me she sat with a young wife last month, 23 years old, married to a petty officer on his first deployment. The girl was crying. Sandra held her hand and said, "Be proud of them even when you don't understand, especially when you don't understand." She keeps a photo of me in her volunteer lanyard. Not a childhood photo, a recent one I sent from overseas. I'm standing in front of a building she'll never know the name of, wearing a uniform she finally recognizes. Tyler writes letters. Not emails, not texts, actual handwritten letters, on paper, in envelopes with stamps. He writes about his life. His daughter Lily's softball games, she plays shortstop now and she's good. A new project at his construction company, a community center in Chesterfield County. He doesn't apologize in the letters anymore. He's done that. Instead, he just includes me, updates me, treats me like someone who matters enough to write to. His last letter ended with this: "I told Lily about you. Not the details, just that her aunt serves her country in ways most people will never know about. She asked if you were a superhero. I said yes." I laughed when I read that. Actually laughed, out loud, alone in my quarters, at 2200 on a Wednesday night. My eyes burned a little. That might be the nicest thing my brother has ever said to me. Tonight I stepped outside after my shift ended. The air is warm, thick and heavy, the kind of warm that sticks to your skin and doesn't let go. The sky is clear and the stars are different here. Brighter, lower, like they're closer to the ground than they are back home. I reached into my pocket and touched the folded note. I carry it everywhere now. I don't need to read it anymore. I know every word, every shaky letter, every crossed out line, every space between the words where my father paused to think about what he wanted to say. You are the best of me. I think about the chapel sometimes, McKeevan's hand on my arm, the grip, firm, dismissive, certain, the kind of grip that belongs to a man who has never once questioned whether he's in charge. My mother's silence, Tyler's shoes, and then the phone call, the 2 seconds it took for the color to leave McKeevan's face. The salute, crisp, deliberate, delivered by a man who suddenly understood that the woman he'd grabbed outranked half the people he'd spent his career commanding. And the standing, the slow, spreading, unstoppable standing, officer after officer rising to their feet until the whole chapel was up, until my mother was looking around like the room itself had changed shape. I think about Sandra at the diner, her cold hands on the coffee mug, the way she said, "I told people you failed." The way she didn't flinch when she said it, like she'd been rehearsing it, like she needed to hear it from her own mouth to believe it was true. I think about Tyler's text, 2 words, "I'm sorry," and my 2 words back, "I know," and how sometimes the smallest exchanges carry the most weight. I think about Thanksgiving and Sandra saying, "She's in the Navy," and Tyler saying, "She can't talk about it," and nobody laughing, nobody rolling their eyes, nobody filling the silence with a story that wasn't true. I think about my father, the garage, the workbench, the engine parts on the floor. The Navy will take everything you're willing to give. He was right, it took everything. My holidays, my family dinners, my reputation, my mother's respect, my brother's affection. 13 years of being someone I wasn't at the one table where I should have been allowed to be myself. It took everything I was willing to give. And some things I wasn't. But it also gave me something. It gave me purpose. It gave me a career that matters. It gave me colleagues who know my name and my rank and what I've done. It gave me the knowledge that the work I do, the quiet, invisible, classified work that nobody in my family will ever fully understand, saves lives. Real lives. Real people who go home to their families because my targeting cell got it right at, 300 on a Tuesday. My father spent 30 years protecting people who would never know his name. I spent 13 years doing the same, and the hardest part wasn't the work. It was watching my own family believe I'd failed. Sitting at that table, hearing the jokes, absorbing the pity, and knowing that the truth was right there, just behind my teeth, and I couldn't let it out. That was the mission nobody trained me for. That was the deployment with no end date. And it nearly broke me. But they know now. Not everything. Not the operations, not the targeting packages, not the call signs or the code words, or the things I've seen on screens in dark rooms that I'll carry until the day I die. Just enough. My mother knows I serve, my brother knows I matter, and my father always knew. I put my hand over the note in my pocket. The paper is soft now, worn thin at the folds from being carried and touched and held against my chest on nights when the work gets heavy and the distance feels like more than miles. You are the best of me. 5 words. Written in a shaking hand 3 weeks before the man who raised me closed his eyes for the last time. 5 words that say everything 13 years of silence couldn't. I take a breath. The air is warm, the stars are low, and somewhere on the other side of the world, my mother is leaving the porch light on. For the first time in my life, enough is exactly right. If this story hit home for you, if you've ever been the one in the family who gets overlooked, dismissed, or defined by a version of you that isn't true, I want you to know something. The people who matter will eventually see you. And the ones who don't, that's not your weight to carry. If you enjoyed this, subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.